The NFL can be a humbling place. One year, you're a prized free agent signing or draft pick. The next year, you need to perform in training camp just to keep a role. We're talking about the Jets under the most pressure to perform at training camp today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, July 22nd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. On today's show, we're going to talk about the Jets under most pressure as training camp practices begin this Thursday. Jets, I guess training camp's unofficially begun, but we're going to focus on the guys who really need to perform in practice. And we're talking about more established guys. We're talking about guys who have at least been around the team and or the NFL for a year. I know the undrafted free agents are under pressure to get a roster spot to try and stay in the league. We're talking about players who are more established and under pressure. And I think that we have to begin by talking about a guy who was probably the biggest free agent signing the Jets made a year ago. Now, of course, remember, Aaron Rodgers was a trade, so he wasn't a free agent signing. But with Rodgers came Allen Lazard. And we know that Rodgers had quite a bit to do with Lazard coming over to the Jets. And to say it did not work out well would be an understatement. Lazard was benched for an undrafted free agent, Jason Brownlee, down the stretch last season. As the Jets decided getting Brownlee game reps would be more valuable than putting Lazard on the field. And I understand that, when you're in the home stretch of a lost season, you try and get young players more time. But look, they weren't benching Garrett Wilson. They weren't benching Sauce Gardner. They were still putting in guys who could play. Lazard's benching. Yeah, part of it was to try and get Brownlee some more reps to get him some more experience. And hopefully that is the type of thing that pays dividends for him, and maybe Brownlee becomes a quality backup receiver in the future. But a lot of it was performance-based, if we're going to be honest. Lazard played himself out of the lineup. An $11 million receiver played himself out of the lineup. And this year, the Jets drafted a guy who could very well take playing time from Lazard. And Malachi Corley, they traded up for him in the third round. In addition to that, they brought in Mike Williams, who I think is kind of the receiver everybody was expecting Allen Lazard to be last year. And, look, if you go back to Lazard's Green Bay career, I don't think last year was that big of a shock. Lazard came in with big expectations, and the expectations Lazard came in with were not matched with his level of performance in Green Bay because he was a very underwhelming player. I mean, the biggest season he had was 2022, where he had 787 yards as a receiver, where he was the number one receiver. So the number one receiver under 800 yards, even though he missed a couple of games. But still, it speaks volumes about the caliber of receiver Lazard was. And I think if we're going to be honest, I don't think Lazard brings any plus attributes to the team. Last year, people were expecting him to be a good at contested catches because he's big. People were expecting him to be good beating press coverage because he's big. The problem is, being big doesn't necessarily make you good at these things. If you have the tools, if you understand how to utilize your skill sets, if you understand how to impose your will because you're big, that's one thing. Lazard's never done that. Lazard, for a guy who's as big as he is, one of the softest receivers you'll ever see. Now, I mean, look, I think the narrative on Lazard is just that he is what he is. And what's telling to me is that you don't even really I was expecting the Jets to really play up the idea of Rodgers being back is going to make him better. I was expecting to hear a lot more of that than we have, which suggests to me that Lazard could be in some trouble here when we're talking about getting playing time. Now, probably not in trouble in terms of a roster spot, unless the Jets find somebody to take this contract off their hands. But I haven't really heard a whole lot of the Jets trying to sell the idea with Rodgers back that will unlock Lazard. In reality, it won't. Lazard's numbers probably would be better with Rodgers if he got ample playing time. They were better with playing with Rodgers in Green Bay because Rodgers is better equipped than, say, a Zach Wilson or a Tim Boyle or Trevor Siemian, just to name three quarterbacks off the top of my head, of finding Lazard when, his route takes him to a hole in the zone. That's the genesis of a lot of Lazard's production. But can Lazard beat coverage? No. Can he make contested catches? Not at a high level. Top guys at contested catches in the league, can catch around 60% of their contested targets. Lazard, he's under 40% for his career. So this is a guy who's big, but he doesn't play big. There's some guys who you always hear in the NFL scouting combine, this guy plays faster than he's timed, and it can be true. Sometimes sometimes there's a guy who may not run 40 yards in a straight line that fast, out of a starting position like a track and field runner. But once they're, when they're on the football field cutting, they know how to set guys up. They know how to make defenders cross their leg. They play faster. Lazard's a guy who's big, who plays like a small receiver. So how's he going to find a role? Well, it's going to be tough. I think that his best possibility would be to kind of carve out a role as a blocker. As weird as it is to say, we're talking about a wide receiver, and I mean, you can go back. I've been hearing this for years about wide receivers. This guy blocks well is always the blanket excuse people have for wide receivers who don't produce. I heard that for Stephen Hill a long time. You want to talk about a guy with no plus attributes? Stephen Hill was up there, a guy the Jets drafted in the second round in 2012. But when we're talking about who's behind Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams, we're not talking about a guy who's going to see a ton of targets. We're not talking about a guy who's most likely going to be able to beat a lot of coverage. I mean, behind him is Xavier Gipson, who did not show a whole lot as a rookie. Now the Jets are, as we talked about last week, Jets are, giving him some buzz based on his work in the offseason program. Maybe he's come along as a route runner. You have Corley, who has been very dangerous with the ball in his hands, but a guy who runs a very rudimentary route tree. I mean, Robert Saleh even kind of suggested around the time of the offseason program, look, it's going to take some time with Corley. So really, I think what you're looking for, I mean, a number 3 receiver is a guy who, can run to the hole in the zone and catch the ball when it comes to him. And you may say, well, Lazard can't do that. And based on last year, you'd be right. I will say this, his drop rate was typically not as high as it was in Green Bay. His drop rate was typically not as high as it was in 2023 with the Jets. So I think there is some hope for regression to the mean, a positive regression to the mean, because Lazard was not the drop machine in Green Bay that he was last year with the Jets. So for me, I think I don't think your number 3 receiver is really going to produce a whole lot. So you find another role. And for Lazard, I do think maybe his blocking could come into play. But here is that his blocking has not been consistent at all. Another guy who had a big reputation as a blocker, and you can see some cut ups on social media. Like there are moments where he throws a great block. I mean, there was he threw a huge block on Breece Hall's big touchdown run against Denver last year in the early season Jets win over the Broncos. He's got the potential to be able to block linebackers, even sometimes defensive linemen. He flashes that. He doesn't do it consistently, though. But I think that Lazard, part of the problem with Lazard is that there's just so much working against him now. I mean, in the offseason program, every time he dropped a pass, it was a big story. People in the fan base is predisposed to dislike him. I think the coaching staff kind of turned on him last year. Again, I don't give the coaching staff credit for much, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I will give them credit for benching Lazard. But he's got to go out there and show he can do the basic things. He did not do them last year. Now in Green Bay, he did some of the basic things. Not enough of the basic things to earn an $11 million per year contract. But if he goes out there and does that, and then you think about, and if Gipson doesn't produce as much, and if Corley shows he's really rudimentary, he's really just a gadget guy at this point, and you start thinking about Lazard's blocking, and if he shows that maybe he can block a little, maybe that's his path to getting that number 3 receiver job. And contrary to what a lot of people think, I mean, I think you can live with Lazard as your number 3 receiver. It's tough to live with Lazard as your number 2 receiver. As your number 3 receiver, if he can add a little blocking, maybe. But part of this requires Lazard to go out there and produce, and Lazard to actually do the easy things. Because last year, Lazard did not show an ability to do the easy things. And the reports out of the offseason program where he was not really doing the easy things in the offseason program. If he can do those things, maybe he's got a shot to maintain his role. If not, then we're looking at an $11 million special teamer. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to another player who had expectations last year, not as high as Lazard. He wasn't a high draft pick, but still a guy who was expected to carve out a role and really was not able to. And the Jets drafted a pair of players who could potentially replace him. It's a big training camp for a second-year player. We'll talk about who that is and why, continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. We all love sports. We love them so much that we never want them to stop. But the playoffs for the NHL and NBA have wound down, and now we've got fewer games. And the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets us help keep the sports going whenever we want. All you have to do is open up the app and dream up some bets anytime you're in the mood. Now, it is baseball season. Yankees and Mets both in action. The All-Star break is behind us. Both of those teams are looking to make a playoff push. Jets will be in action. It's still a few months. There's a chance to get in on the action early there. They are underdogs week 1 against the San Francisco 49ers. But whatever you want to get in on, FanDuel is the place to do it. So head to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen, our first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're talking about Jets training camp. Jets start their practice schedule in training camp this coming Thursday. We're talking about the established members of the Jets who need to produce in training camp this year. We talked about Allen Lazard. Well, there's another skill player who I think very much on the bubble right now. And it's a player a lot of people would not have expected to be on the bubble at the beginning of the offseason. And that is Israel Abanikanda, the second-year running back out of Pittsburgh. This time last year, there was talk that maybe Izzy was the favorite to be the number 2 running back. And then later in the summer, the Jets signed Dalvin Cook, and Dalvin Cook spent 3-4 months making us wish they did not sign Dalvin Cook. Later in the season, Izzy got a few opportunities, but was not able to do a whole lot with them. Only 70 yards on 22 carries. Now, in fairness, Jets' offensive line was brutal last year, especially the late part of the season. Abanikanda had to run behind a line that was not great. At the same time, I think you can see the difference between Izzy and a Breece Hall. And while Izzy had a reputation for having a lot of speed, I don't think he flashed it a whole lot. And I think that was even true last year in preseason. I mean, I think he had a few moments. He had a touchdown run in a preseason game, but I was not overly impressed by what I saw from him. And then this year, the Jets draft a pair of running backs on day 3. Somewhat infamously, a lot of Jets fans were very unhappy the Jets drafted a pair of running backs on day 3. Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin, Isaiah Davis, small school running back out of South Dakota State. You say what you will about that. The fact the Jets drafted 2 running backs on day 3 means that Izzy Abanikanda's roster spot is no longer guaranteed. And his role as number 2 running back certainly not guaranteed because, as we said last year when people were trying to talk Izzy up, running back's one of the few positions where it may not be likely, but there's at least a reasonable chance that a guy drafted day 3 as a rookie can step in and have a role on your team. It's at least a better shot of that happening than happening at some position like receiver or defensive end, a tougher spot. And I think a lot of that has to do with the relative lack of technique at running back. Of course, there is technique and it still matters at the running back position. I'm not here to say that, technique's irrelevant at the running back position, but, wide receiver, there's a lot of footwork. There's a lot of nuance. Typically you have a bigger route tree. You have to run routes you've never run before once you step into the league. At running back, you get the handoff and you either break tackles or you don't. And that's kind of the same as it is in college. Now, there's more to it than that. I think there are more complex aspects of playing the running back position in this league, especially when we're talking about pass protection, which is not something that's really emphasized at the college level. A lot of guys step into the NFL, they have no idea how to pass protect at the running back position. But relatively speaking, there's a reason you see running backs come out of nowhere and produce for their teams at a higher rate than you do practically any other position. And last year, that was something that seemed like it worked in Izzy's favor. This year, Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin was generating a lot of buzz in the offseason program, especially about his soft hands. Allen was not a guy who was used a lot in the passing game at Wisconsin, but you know what? I don't think that that's necessarily indicative of anything. When I watched the film on Braylon Allen, it looked like he had good hands, looked like he could adjust to balls that were thrown off target. It's one thing to have done something in college. It's another to be able to do something. Just because you may not have done something in college, but you might be able to do it. Your team just maybe never asked it of you. Braylon Allen's really interesting. A guy who came in 2021 at 17 years old, at the age where he should have been in high school, dominated the Big Ten, and then not quite as good the next 2 seasons. But, for a 4th round pick, I kind of like the idea of getting somebody who flashed dominance at a young age. And maybe you can unlock that at another level. Or Davis, a small school guy. For a small school guy, especially if, a 5th round small school guy, you have to look like a man among boys. And there were many moments, if you watch the Davis film, where he looked like a man among boys. He looked like the best player on the field. And if you're going up against smaller school competition, that's how you have to look. Because if you're going to be a good NFL player should dominate lower levels of competition. And by all accounts, you can look at the stats, you can look at the film. Davis did that. So Izzy Abanikanda is not just facing pressure from one guy. He's facing pressure from 2. And, maybe the Jets drafted him a year ago, but it's not like they used a 1st round pick on him. It's not like they have that much invested in him. And it's not just that Izzy Abanikanda's role as number 2 running back's in peril. It is. His roster spot may be in peril because it's not a guarantee the Jets are going to keep more than 4 running backs on this 53-man roster. And Breece Hall's spot's guaranteed. You would think they're going to, they've seemed like they've been wanting to keep Nick Bodden the last couple of years. Seems like they want a fullback on the roster. Some teams just use a tight end when they have a fullback role called on a play. Some teams just kind of use fullbacks and tight ends interchangeably. But last couple of years, the Jets have utilized Nick Bodden. I would think that he's probably got a spot on the team. That leaves 2 spots left, potentially, if you're only keeping 4. And yeah, I'm not saying the Jets used high picks on Allen or Davis, but they used picks more recently than they did on Anaconda. And I think on some level, and the Jets will deny this, on some level, if you're going to use 2 day 3 picks on a position that's one of the lowest value positions on the field, maybe the lowest value position on the field of the regular spots, running back, if you use 2 picks on that on day 3, it's got to be some sort of indication that you aren't thrilled with the depth you've got. Now, look, I think the Jets are very satisfied with their starter, Breece Hall. I don't think that the drafting 2 running backs had anything to do with Breece. I think it had something to do with how they view their running back depth. And part of me is happy because the Jets have this tendency to bring in these really old running backs, these huge name running backs at the end of their careers, and it almost never works out. And Cook was the latest vintage of that last year. You could go back to Matt Forte. You could go back to Le'Veon Bell. Go back to Chris Johnson. You could even go back to LaDainian Tomlinson, whose Jets tenure was nowhere near as successful, I would argue, as people remember it to be. It doesn't work out. So the Jets going young at running back, but maybe too young to keep their second year back. It'll be something worth watching. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a spot where the Jets, I think, have a genuine position battle on their hands. It's on the defensive side of the ball. It might be the one defensive spot that's not set. We'll go into more detail on that, continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just a jobs board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. And on LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Now, the Jets, they have a front office and scouting staff, so I'm not sure they need to use LinkedIn. Well, your small business probably doesn't. LinkedIn can be your scouting staff. And LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and may not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even just launched the feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and even quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about Jets who need to perform in training camp, but we're focused on more of the established players. We all know that anybody who's undrafted, anybody who's not established in this league needs to perform in training camp to keep a job in the league. Maybe it's earning a 53-man roster spot. Maybe it's earning a practice squad spot. And, performing in preseason might help you earn a spot with another team in the league. Even if you don't make the Jets, there might be another team watching film that likes you and maybe you earn a spot on their team. We're not focused on that today. We're focused on established players. And we're going to end the show by talking about what I think is one of the few genuine position battles the Jets have. And that's at the safety position. We talked about this a little bit last week. There's kind of this 3-man battle. And in some ways, it's not as significant as we make it out to be by calling it a position battle, because of the trio of Chuck Clark, Tony Adams, and Ashton Davis, all 3 of them are going to find playing time. Adams was a starter last year. Davis became a quality role player for the Jets, if not a starter. Clark has a reputation for being a really good player. I've said this over and over. I'll say it again. I thought one of the few savvy moves the Jets made last offseason, and there were not many. The last offseason was a disaster for the Jets, but one of the few savvy moves was throwing a 7th-round pick at the Baltimore Ravens to get Chuck Clark. And it was a situation where Clark really had done nothing wrong. Clark was a very good player. The issue was simply that the Ravens just had a loaded safety room. So they were going to lose Clark in a year anyway, and Clark was kind of resigned to being a backup there. So they said, let's just get a draft pick for this guy. And Jets were able to get a really good player, and unfortunately, he suffered that injury in the offseason and never took the field. And the Jets, I thought the Jets were set to have some really good 3 safety looks last year. Well, now they can with Clark back in the mix. Now Jordan Whitehead has left in free agency, but Jets could have a pretty good 3-safety package with Adams, Clark, and Davis. And Davis was a guy who was a massive disappointment. Like, there's no other way to put it. Davis was a massive disappointment. He was a 3rd-round pick in 2020. I don't want to say the Jets drafted him to be the replacement for Jamal Adams, but that was at a point where Jets were having all these issues with Adams. And there was no guarantee Marcus May was going to stick around for the long term either. So I think the Jets drafted Davis in the 3rd round with the expectation that he would eventually step into a starting role. And what he gave you his first 2 years in the league was not good. In fact, I remember commenting, and I think it was true, that the caliber of play Davis gave the Jets in 2021 was so bad. It was some of the worst safety play I've ever seen. I mean, this was a guy who was constantly out of position. I mentioned this the other day. Davis's missed tackles that resulted in 30-yard runs added a full half yard to the Jets' average yards per attempt against defensively in 2021. That's not what you need. That's not good. And then Tony Adams, undrafted free agent a couple of years back, who stepped into a starting role last year and was up and down. What I'll say about Tony Adams is that, if he's like your 3rd or 4th best player on defense, you're in trouble. Tony Adams is your 10th or 11th best player. You're in pretty good shape because he's up and down, but he's not a total liability. I've seen total liabilities at the safety position for the Jets. I've seen a lot of them. Safety is one of those positions. I've been watching the Jets 30 years. And there's some positions they could just never figure out. Tight end's one of them. Safety's been another. It's just been a problem consistently. I mean, the few exceptions were the Kerry Rhodes era, then the Adams-May era. Outside of those two eras, I mean, I can't think of many times I watched the Jets where I thought the safety play was good. Adams is not a Pro Bowler at this point. I think the Jets have high hopes for him. The Jets certainly were hyping him up a year ago, but it's not a major weakness. So the safety position, it's not great, but when these 3 safeties constitute your worst unit on defense, again, you're pretty good. If the safety position was the best unit on the Jets defense with these guys, I'd be a little worried. When it's your worst, I think you can live with that. The question is who gets the bulk of the snaps, and that's really what it's about. These guys, the Jets will throw three safety looks out there. That's how Robert Saleh functions. Robert Saleh likes to have guys who can run. Robert Saleh likes to have guys who can cover ground. How do you make your defense faster? Well, you replace a linebacker with a safety because safeties are faster than linebackers. The question is, who are the top 2 guys? And I think the incumbents would be Adams and Clark. Even though Clark was out last year, he was expected to have a pretty big role. The question with Davis is, can he handle more? And that's really what it boils down to. Because last year, Davis played a very limited role. He played a very specific role. He did very well with it. He kind of became adept at, that move where you rip the ball out. I mean, a couple came off the board because of reviews, but Davis became adept at forcing fumbles a year ago. He kind of turned into a playmaker. Guy I might equate him to is Eric Smith, guy who was with the Jets for a long time from 2006 to 2012. And when Eric Smith was a role player, when he played in sub packages, when you played him kind of like as a big nickel, you played him as safety as in a linebacker role, he was very good. He was also an ace special teamer, as Davis was. The problem with Eric Smith is once he got into a starting role, he was overexposed. In 2011, he was a starter and remember playing very poorly that year. The question is, can Davis grow into more than that? I'd say right now that's about what Davis is. Early in his career, when he was pushed into a full-time starting role, he really struggled. Later, now he's proven he can handle a more situational role. And he's a good special teamer. Can he handle more, though? Can he become a capable starting safety in the league? Training camp this year is an opportunity to find out. And as I would also say that it's the opportunity for Tony Adams to fend him off, opportunity for Chuck Clark to show he's healthy. Chuck Clark, a lot of what I'm basing all this praise of him on is what he was in Baltimore. He's coming off an injury, and I think whenever you're coming off an injury, you got to show you still can do it. You got to show you still have it. So a lot on the line for these safeties this year for the Jets. It's one of the few true. Even though last week I did a show where I said it's a position battle, it isn't really a position battle because all 3 guys are getting playing time. But on another level, I'm going to give you the converse today and say that it's a spot where we are trying to pick out 2 starters here. So in that sense, in some senses it's not a position battle. In some senses it is. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.